Hey everybody, sorry I'm not with you today. Lynn and I had an opportunity to go down and see our kids perform in a concert at Pepperdine University in Malibu and decided to make a weekend of it. So while you're watching this, she and I are literally driving back on beautiful and scenic and sometimes fragrant I-5. So anyway, pray for us that we don't have any trouble or just are bored to death because it's a terrible, awful drive. But anyway, we'll be back sometime this afternoon as you're watching this. I'm loving this series on Adam Hamilton's book called Unafraid. And this week we're taking a look at being unafraid as it pertains to race. As I was reading this particular chapter, I chuckled because I didn't realize that Adam Hamilton and I could practically tell the same stories about where we grew up because we grew up essentially in the same place. He speaks about growing up in Prairie Village, Kansas, which is a suburb of Kansas City. Prairie Village is where my dad's church was, Prairie Baptist Church. And that's where I grew up. He was pastor there for 10 years. I spent the first 8 years of my life going to that church every week, literally born into that church. We didn't live in Prairie Village. We lived in another suburb called Overland Park, which at that time was pretty big. Now it's massive. It's been rated one of the best places to grow up, to live for all kinds of reasons. Great schools, great economy. It's a great place. Lynn and I still love Kansas City, have family back in that area. It's really, really nice place. But I totally concur with Hamilton's experience. There is a dividing line in the city. And while Kansas City itself and the entire area, which now is a couple million people, is quite diverse, the areas that we grew up in were not. In our church, we had, at that time, it was like an up and coming suburb, a lot of professionals in the area. I think we had an Asian family from Chinese descent in our church, which we were good friends with. Still to this day, still good friends. Down the street from where we lived was my brother's best friend, Billy. And Billy's family was Filipino. And other than that, we had, except for some Laotian folks that were refugees in our church, man, I cannot think of too many other people of other skin tones than mine. I honestly, for the first 8 years of my life, I may have met one or two here and there, but I didn't know any African Americans, even though Kansas City, has lots of diversity. And we moved from Kansas City to Ottawa, Kansas, which is a small town about 45 miles south of there, where my dad was a college president, and the college had great diversity, which was cool. A little frightening for me as a kid because I'd never seen so much diversity in my life. I was healthy, but in the school that I went to, I had one black friend, um, one friend that was of Hispanic descent, and that's it. That's it. From there, I moved to Michigan, and we lived in a wealthy suburb of Lansing, Michigan. And there was, for the first several years that I was there was one black kid, and he knew it. And this is really awkward and embarrassing for me and for him too. Um, this was when Michael Jackson was like coming into his own, and Thriller and all that was awesome. This kid actually looked a little bit like Michael Jackson and could dance like Michael Jackson. So everybody loved him. And, he got along swimmingly. But then some kids from another part of town, from Lansing, because Lansing was pretty diverse, moved in. These were black kids from the other side of the tracks, so to speak. There was a culture clash, man. And I remember one time there was a fight after school, and the new black kids were letting the guy that we knew, the only other black kid in school, knew that they were different. It was just weird. So My experience about race is awkward. And, I think back to Kansas. Kansas is a strange state where they're very proud of their role with the Underground Railroad, and celebrate that. And yet, as Hamilton notes in his book, there were some awkward realities about Kansas City. Kansas City, a lot of the footprint of Kansas City and the design of the city had a guy named J.C. Nichols behind it. But J.C. Nichols, who was big on plan development, and one of his housing developments, this was written in the HOA that Hamilton shared. So this is right in the covenant of the housing development. None of the said lots shall be conveyed to, used, owned, or occupied by Negroes as owner and tenants. And then later, Hamilton notes this covenant was extended to Jewish people as well, which of course means that Jesus would not be allowed to move next door, which is awkward. It's written right there in the HOA. Well, let's talk about some definitions here on this stuff, because this is a sensitive topic and awkward and uncomfortable, and we need to get some terms under our belt. So first, let's talk about racism. I don't know if I'll put this on screen or not, but racism is defined as prejudice, discrimination, or antagonism directed against someone of different race based on the belief that one's race is superior. Prejudice, which showed up in the definition of racism, is defined as dislike, hostility, or unjust behavior deriving from unfounded opinions. So that sounds a little bit like the fear thing we've been talking about, the false expectations appearing real. That shows up there. And then there's another word that shows up in this chapter in particular called xenophobia. And xenophobia is defined as intense or irrational dislike or fear of people from other countries. So let's just get some stuff out there and ask the question, are we racists? Do we struggle with racism or prejudice or xenophobia? Well, it turns out there's a very quick and easy test that you can do to find out if you indeed struggle with any of these things on any level of these things. It's a pretty profound test. It's very wide spectrum. And all you got to do is this. So you take your finger from one hand and you place it on your wrist on the other. And if you can't feel a pulse there, then try it on the side of your neck. And here's the test. You have to use some sensitivity here. But if you can feel your pulse, it means you struggle with racism, prejudice, and xenophobia. You may be calling BS on me at this moment, and you're welcome to do that. BS, of course, stands for Bible study. And if you are calling me on that, and if you want to get more advanced, there's actually a Harvard test you can take. It's on implicit bias. And certainly all of us struggle with implicit bias, but that is part of what leads to racism, prejudice, and xenophobia. It's a free test. Go blow your mind. I'm putting a link on this blog so you can go do it, and it'll test you on all sorts of stuff about where our implicit bias takes us. But the reality is, for every culture all over the world, there is implicit bias in favor of the dominant culture. What that means is, in the United States, the dominant culture is Caucasian. And so, for most people in the United States, when they take an implicit bias test, they have a bias toward or in favor of white people. That's even among people of color, by the way. That this is ingrained in our culture, that white is best, white is the winner, whatever. What's interesting, fascinating, is if you go to other parts of the world and they do this same test, you will discover that whatever that dominant culture is, that is the culture that gets the implicit bias, or they are favored, which makes sense. Why? Because like likes like. We like what is normal to us, what is familiar to us, and that's not uncommon. So first we just have to realize this is who we are. This is what we are. This is a part of us, and even though I don't like it and it's awkward, it's still there. And I hope you can get there too, in your own respective ways, and whatever that means, that we all struggle with this thing. It doesn't mean that you're a horrible person, it means you're human. And it turns out this is a very old problem. Hamilton talks about some biblical examples, and I'm going to build on that. He talks about Cain and Abel and suggests that this is a story that gives us a picture of a bias or prejudice, a tension that existed between herdsmen and farmers. Cain was a farmer, kind of an ag guy, tilling the soil. Abel was a herdsman, wandering his flocks around, probably eating Cain's crops, which partly ticked him off. Remember that the stories that we have in Genesis, many of them were written down hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years into Israel's history. So while Cain and Abel, that story is about much more than that, for sure. There's a lot of depths there about who the people of Israel are and who they were becoming. But when it was written, certainly this issue was there. And so there was a tension between these two people groups. And one of those groups did not look so favorably on the other. In fact, probably by this time in history, and certainly by the time Jesus was around, there was an implicit bias in favor of the agrarian cultural folks, farmers, and an implicit bias against herdsmen. They were kind of low on the totem pole. If you were a shepherd, even now you can go over to Israel and you'll see the Bedouins walking around. People look down their nose at them as less than. And it's just the way it was, and it's just the way it is. If we move forward in biblical history, we find ourselves at Jesus' first sermon, and he immediately ticks people off because he suggests in his first sermon, and I give you a link in my blog on this, but he suggests that God is more inclusive than they want to hear. Generally, the Jewish people believed that they were the chosen people, that God's grace and love was fairly exclusivistic in their favor. And so right away, first sermon that Jesus teaches, he eradicates that. And from their own history, speaking about their most beloved prophets, Elijah and Elisha, Jesus shows how even back then, God favored non-Jews over Jewish people in those instances. Well, that was not welcome news. In fact, that sermon almost got Jesus killed, and the whole thing almost ended before it started. Crazy. If you were to look at the people group that was most disliked, least liked by Jewish people in Jesus' time, hands down it would be the Samaritan people. They were looked at as hybrids from Jewish people. The Samaritan area was sandwiched just between where Jesus grew up in northern Israel and the Jerusalem area, which was in southern Israel. And so there was a lot of animosity, and you couldn't miss each other in there. And they hated each other. Samaritans were not fond of Jewish people either, so, that's fair. So what do we see Jesus doing? This guy who is daring to claim that God is inclusive and not exclusive, as was thought. Well, in John chapter 4, we see Jesus going and having a conversation and befriending a Samaritan woman with a bad reputation. Later on, and that goes well. In fact, all the disciples end up camping out with Jesus in Samaria, something I'm sure they never thought they would do. Had to be a total mind bender for them. Later on, Jesus tells a parable, probably his best known parable. Do you know what it is? It's the Good Samaritan. In this particular story, I give you links to this on my blog, by the way. What's fascinating is Jesus draws a contrast between the religious leaders of his day and this Samaritan. The religious leaders of the day blow it. They fail the test of who is a godly, compassionate person. And the hero of the story, to everyone's surprise, and it was probably laughable when he told the story, was the Samaritan. In fact, we call it the Good Samaritan. But in those circles, if you would have said, hey, I got a story, the story's called the Good Samaritan, your audience would immediately bust out in a big laugh, because in their mind, There's no such thing as a good Samaritan. It's sort of like in our culture. Hey, let me tell you about a good politician. And everybody's like, oh, that's hilarious. Well, that's kind of the same vibe that you had back then. Okay, so that was Jesus, and he certainly did so many things to break barriers and incredibly bold in terms of his being inclusive of other people and challenging his followers to do the same. But even though he challenged it and he modeled it and even took his disciples along with him on the journey, it was still tough to learn. So we catch up with Peter. This is after Jesus' death, burial, resurrection. The new church has started. Some bold things are happening. Pentecost has happened, which we'll celebrate in a few weeks, when the Holy Spirit just showed up in an extremely powerful way, not just for a few people, but with tons of people, which was just unheard of. And another sign of an exclusivistic kind of God at work here. Inclusive, not exclusive. Now, all these people had the Spirit with them instead of just a few. Well, anyway, after that all happens, Peter finds himself hanging out at a beach house with a friend that he learned about somehow along the way. And while he's up there, he has this strange vision, which I give you a link to in my blog. And this vision has to do with food rights. And Peter is having this struggle because he's hungry. He likes to eat like meat. And he has this vision of all these different foods being lowered from heaven in this massive sheet type thing. And all the foods in there are foods that Jewish people are forbidden to eat. And he hears a voice from heaven saying, take and eat. And he's having this fight with God, and he's saying, no, I'm not going to do that because I know the right thing to do, and it's to not eat that. Well, he gets this voice from God saying, all right, you're kind of missing the point. This is all to set you up for what's about to happen. So these people are going to come knock at the door, Peter, and just go with them. Just trust me on this. And so Peter, the vision is over, and there's a knock at the door. And as these people, servants of a centurion, who is a high-ranking military official named Cornelius, and they are asking Peter to come with them to meet with Cornelius. You're a Jewish guy in occupied territory. You are being asked to go see a centurion. That doesn't sound too good. Peter remembers the voice. Doesn't sound too good for lots of reasons. Sounds like you're going to get killed. But also, this guy's a Gentile. And Jewish people generally don't like Gentiles. So he decides to trust the voice, and he goes and he finds out that this whole household, Cornelius' household, wants to know about Jesus. And so, very begrudgingly, in an embarrassingly awkward way, Peter starts to tell him about Jesus. And before he gets too far into his whole spiel, all of a sudden, the Holy Spirit dumps on this household. And all these Gentile people who haven't even been baptized yet are doing things that evidence the fact that the Spirit is actually with them. And Peter's looking at this thinking, wow, well, that's new. Did not see that coming. And then decided that if God had already given them the Holy Spirit, then why not let them be baptized with water? So that very day, he baptizes the whole household. This was crazy. I mean, just crazy. I don't even know how to quite express this and what this would look like today, but this is as mind-blowing as you can get in terms of breaking through barriers. Now, that's what Peter was doing. And then Paul, later kind of a Johnny-come-lately guy who was a Jesus follower, responsible for planting churches all over the Mediterranean, most of the people he did it with were Gentiles. I mean, it's amazing. Actually, by the end of the first century, there were very few Jewish Christians left. The vast majority of them were Gentile Christians. Fascinating how this once exclusive sect from Judaism became this inclusive movement that nobody saw coming. In fact, when Paul was busy doing his stuff, he ran into this problem with others. I may or may not put this on the screen. The entire letter that you have in your New Testament called the Book of Romans, that whole letter is Paul writing to a group of people who are struggling with inclusion. You have Jewish Christians who think they're the best, and they're whining and complaining because they don't want to share the communion table with all these Gentile Christians, non-Jewish Christians. And so Paul writes this letter using their own theology against them to help them see, hey, wake up. You know, this God is bigger than you're allowing God to be. You're taking your root back to Abraham and saying that you have a bigger right to the table and to God's grace because you claim Abraham as your origin. Well, I'm telling you, Adam is your origin. So you all go back to the same starting place. You're the same. There's no them and us. There's just us, is kind of what he's getting at. And God's grace is big enough and for everybody. That's what the whole book of Romans is addressing. And Paul does a masterful job of it. It's incredible. Later on, he talks to a group. Well, actually, I'm not sure if this is later on, but one of the other letters you have in your, actually it's earlier, in your New Testament is called Paul's letter to the Galatians. This was a general letter to an entire geographical area, and it was going to all the churches in this particular zone because all of these fledgling churches had heard from some well-meaning but way off Jewish Christians called the Judaizers that unless they started following Jewish law, they were really less than. And that ticked Paul off because he knew better, and so he wrote some famous words. So this is what he ends up writing to them. It says, "For you are all children of God through faith in Jesus Christ. And all who have been united with Christ in baptism have put on Christ, like putting on new clothes." So this is the phenomenal thing that he eventually says. He says, "There is no longer Jew or Gentile, slave or free, male and female, for you are all one in Christ Jesus. And now that you belong to Christ, you are the true children of Abraham. You are his heirs, and God's promise to Abraham belongs to you." This is awesome. Paul totally gets this and understands what's happening and throws it their way. All these biblical references that I'm giving you, and there's one more to come in just a bit, but all of this is just to make it plain that this issue is deep-seated in human history and that we struggle with it over time, and we still struggle with it over time. The tragic reality is that here we live in the United States of America, which claims to promote liberty and justice for all, but we know that it's not to the same degree for all. And that's really hard for people who look like me to understand that. But I think it's true. And I think that, and know that, we all struggle to varying degrees with this implicit bias / racism / prejudice / xenophobia. We all do. That's the baseline. That is us being honest with ourselves, honest with our addiction to our own kind, if you will. And we need help to get over that, or to manage it, because it's something that will have to be managed forever. It's not that I think that you're, hiding your KKK sheet in your closet and that you're planning on burning crosses or something anytime soon. That's not it. But I do think there are some things that we can learn about ourselves and how we speak and act and live that if we see it and can recognize it and start to change it, I think we're going to be better off as people, and I think we might be able to make the world better too. So Brene Brown, who I've quoted before, shown you some of her work before, she wrote an incredible book called Daring Greatly. Highly recommend it to anybody to read that book. Her most recent book is called Braving the Wilderness, and she speaks into this racism issue and helps us understand a tool, a method that humanity has used for a very long time that leads to some of the ugliest and most horrific expressions of racism. It has to do with dehumanizing. And I'm going to give you this quote on screen. So this is what she says about dehumanizing. It's about legitimizing our mistreatment of other people. She writes, "Dehumanizing and holding people accountable are mutually exclusive. Humiliation and dehumanizing are not accountability or social justice tools. They're emotionally offloading at best, emotional self-indulgence at worst. And if our faith asks us to find the face of God in everyone we meet, which, by the way, it does, that should include the politicians, media, and strangers on Twitter with whom we most violently disagree. When we desecrate their divinity, we desecrate our own, and we betray our faith. Those are powerful words. She goes on in her book to talk about how this dehumanization with our language is what enabled Nazi Germany to literally exterminate millions of Jews. Started off slow, just a little slur here and there to just distinguish the Jewish people as other, and then led to grosser statements that really turned them into rats, worthy of extinction. What we may not realize is we do that same kind of thing all the time. We can easily see it in our politicians because they do it, and election cycle is it seems like it's always upon us, and we can count on our politicians to go to that lowest level, to call on our fears and to denigrate whoever they're running against as a means to cause us to distance ourselves from the other candidate. All the while not promoting their own agenda, not really talking about what they're going to do, but focusing our attention on how you don't want to be associated with that loser. So be aware of that when you hear politicians talking that way, and don't be afraid to call it out. I've got a big issue with that, just to be transparent with our politicians right now. I think it's absolutely disgusting, immature, and childish when our politicians resort to using language that dehumanizes the other and goes after character immediately. And let's be clear, this is happening on both sides of the aisle. And what I want to suggest to you is that that is part of the problem that we are facing in our country. We can blame the media all we want, and they are part of our fear as well. But hey, if the media is reporting on what our politicians, our nation's leaders are saying and how they're speaking of other people, that's inappropriate. And we've got to get back to a civility if we ever hope to be as civil of a country as we aspire to be. One of the issues that comes up, and this is up close and personal and extremely current, that Brene Brown brings up, has to do with the Black Lives Matter movement. Because if we're talking about being unafraid in the face of race, there's no greater tension in America right now than that between white and black America. You're sitting here on Sunday morning, and it has been stated many times over many decades that the most segregated hour in the United States is 11 o'clock on Sunday morning when people go to church, because that's when we find ourselves in like company. Now, I hope Crosswalk will become more and more colorful, more and more multicultural. I think that's good and healthy and wonderful. But this Black Lives Matter movement has caused a lot of division in our country. Some people say, well, we shouldn't just say Black Lives Matter, we should say Blue Lives Matter too, because we want to support police officers, and I do too. And my brother-in-law is a highway patrolman in Missouri. I care deeply about his safety. He's not a brother-in-law, he's a brother and a good friend. I don't want anything to happen to him. And some other people say, well, all lives matter, so we should just go with that. And Brene Brown has a thoughtful response to that. So this is what she says. She says, shouldn't the rallying cry just be all lives matter? No, because the humanity wasn't stripped from all lives the way it was stripped from the lives of black citizens. In order for slavery to work, in order for us to buy, sell, beat, and trade people like animals, Americans had to completely dehumanize slaves. And whether we directly participated in that or were simply a member of a culture that at one time normalized that behavior, it shaped us. We can't undo that level of dehumanizing in 1 or 2 generations. Just wanted you to read that over again. We can't undo that level of dehumanizing in 1 or 2 generations. I believe Black Lives Matter is a movement to rehumanize black citizens. All lives matter, but not all lives need to be pulled back into moral inclusion. Not all people were subjected to the psychological process of demonizing and being made less than human so we could justify the inhumane practice of slavery. Whew. How do you feel about that? How's that messing with you? You know, one of the comments that I hear from people who look like me, and just normal, casual conversation. Sometimes these conversations have happened at church, after church, in my Wednesday groups. I've heard this, and it's okay that this came out. Is this part of our dialogue and growing and learning and all that? Sometimes it's happened at a dinner party with friends or just hanging out, at the mailbox, talking with my neighbors and talking about, Black Lives Matter or whatever the group is that we're talking about. The statement will be, I just don't understand why they, and then they fill in the blank. So if it's with a Black Lives Matter protest or something, they usually say, I just understand why the protest gets out of hand and cars need to be burned or windows need to be smashed or whatever. Or I just don't understand why they need to get in the way of people trying to get into a Sacramento Kings game. Or I just don't understand why they need to shut down traffic on 880 going through Oakland. Or I just don't understand why the LGBT community does it this way. Or I just don't understand why the gays or the black people or why the Mexicans or why the illegal immigrants. All of these ways of thinking get at one thing. We don't understand. We don't understand. And that is a great place to start, is by admitting we don't understand. I am a white male. I even have blue eyes. I'm of Dutch descent. It was my heritage, my people, that took slavery, which has been going on forever, and took it to a whole new level of importing them, stealing them from countries, treating them like animals, and bringing them to America. As a white guy, I don't understand. It's difficult for me to understand what it's like to be black in America. It's difficult for me to understand what it would be like to be an immigrant, an illegal immigrant, who crossed the border illegally so that they could work here in the United States and provide for my family back in Mexico or wherever I came from. I don't understand what it's like to be gay because I'm not. I don't understand what it's like to be a woman because I'm not. And that's the right place to begin, with just admitting, I don't understand. The mistake we make is we don't understand and then we rush to judgment. And we say, well, you should have done it like this, or why are you doing that? And what I'm saying is, before we rush to that judgment, before we throw on our agenda, our mindset, our way of viewing things, which has been from a perspective of I'm on top of the world, maybe we need to do something to learn about these others who somewhere deep within us we don't understand and therefore don't like and therefore are maybe uncomfortable with and maybe fearful of. Hard stuff. Maybe if you have somebody in your neighborhood or in your workplace or somewhere where you have proximity toward one of these others, be they black or Muslim or whatever, or gay or whatever, then maybe it's time to extend a hand and just invite for a cup of coffee and just say, you know what, I'm learning that there's a lot I don't understand, and I'm wondering if I could just learn from your experience. I mean, good grief. How much could you learn? How wonderful a bridge would that create? You know, I don't want to be trapped by implicit bias. I know that it's there. And you know what? You know, in terms of cognitively and consciously, I can say with assurance I'm not afraid of any particular people groups, and yet I know that this implicit bias thing is real, and I know that I'm not consciously prejudiced. I don't try to be. I don't think that way, and yet I know that it's buzzing around in my veins, and I hate it. And if anything, it makes me nervous, just to be honest, because I don't want to screw it up. It's like I don't want to find out the hard way that I say something wrong or awkward that is offensive to somebody that I don't want to offend. And that's worth it to me to find out what I don't know. It's worth it for me to not be okay with, I just don't understand. And so it means I got to do something to learn about what I don't understand. And so because we don't always have proximity toward folks who are unlike us, the good news is there are plenty of other ways to do that. You can read books, you can watch TED Talks, you watch videos, you listen to podcasts. There's plenty of ways to get to know more and more the experience of those who somehow threaten us. And so I would highly recommend that you do that. And read widely, listen widely, so that you just don't get one perspective that might likely affirm all of your fears, but that you would listen to a wide range of people from different perspectives so that you get a fuller understanding of what's going on. There is one other biblical reference that Hamilton brings up in his book that we close with today. And this comes out of one of the last parts of the New Testament that you have in your Bible. This comes from the Apostle John, the guy who wrote the book of Revelation and the Gospel of John and wrote 3 letters, 1 John, 2 John, 3 John. This comes out of 1 John chapter 4. And this is the Message version. I like the way Eugene Peterson does this. So John is speaking to, a group of people that are struggling with others, and other people are telling them that they're less than, and they're in this tension. So how do you live? How do you live when there's an us and them mentality? How do you get toward a more that's just us and not an us and them? And so John writes these very thoughtful, insightful words. He says, God is love. When we take up permanent residence in a life of love, we live in God and God lives in us. This way, love has the run of the house, becomes at home and mature in us, so that we're free of worry on Judgment Day. Our standing in the world is identical with Christ's. There is no room in love for fear. Well-formed love banishes fear. Since fear is crippling, a fearful life, fear of death, fear of judgment, is one not yet fully formed in love. We, though, are going to love and be loved. First we were loved, now we love. He loved us first. If anyone boasts, I love God, and goes on right on hating his brother or sister, thinking nothing of it, he is a liar. If he won't love the person he can see, how can he love the God he can't see? The command we have from Christ is blunt. Loving God includes loving people. You've got to love both. Are there people that you love to hate? Seriously? Are there people that come to mind that you just absolutely disdain, that you cannot stand? They may be people that you actually know, or they may be figures that are widely known in our culture. Politicians, perhaps. There are people that you love to hate. Be aware. be aware that that is in contrast to the way that we've been loved. And while you may have real substantive differences with people that you want to disagree with, that does not mean that we have the right to speak or act in unloving ways. One of the great helps and tools that Hamilton gives us in this chapter is a little mantra, a little idea to live by. And he encourages let's try that again. He encourages us to ask ourselves, in the situation I find myself in, what is the most loving thing I can do? In the situation I find myself in, what is the most loving thing I can do? That's good advice. That helps minimize fear and serves to create a better world in which to live for everyone. Hope you all have a great week. Look forward to seeing you on Wednesday if you can make it for further discussion on this. I'm going to show you a little video clip from a biblical scholar named William Willimon, who's got something to say about xenophobia. It's really fascinating. And can't wait to have conversation with you about this. Hope you're enjoying the series. I know I am. It's helping me grow a lot, and I hope it's helping you grow too. We will see you upon our return. Thanks a lot. See you soon.